Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Allen. Every year at the start of Lent, Catholics like myself attend Mass where the priest puts ashes on our foreheads and recites a line from the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. Remember that you are dust, and unto dust you shall return. And that tradition and Old Testament verse serves as a good reminder of our mortality. COVID has served as a reminder too. When in your lifetime has the media, politicians, and the world been so focused on death than in the past 18 months? I can still hear in my head New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo's words at a press conference last year where he infamously justified his lockdown policies with the rhetorical line, "What is worse than death?" And now, as many parts of Canada slowly lift out of lockdown and secondary pandemics like the ballooning mental health crisis emerge, the question, what is worse than death, remains. So are there things worse than death? And who gets to make that decision for you? Who gets to decide? Who does the thinking for you? The government, the scientists, yourself, a combination? And with COVID, who should make healthcare choices for you and your family? Who is best positioned? Who really has your best interests or your health interests at heart? When children who have nearly zero risk of death of COVID are being asked to get vaccinated at the risk of side effects, including myocarditis, who has their best interests? When we hear rhetoric that we have a pandemic of the unvaccinated, is that really helping, or is that just causing division? Are we still all in this together? And how can we reframe our thinking in light of mortality, in balancing personal freedom? How can we approach the ethics of COVID from a compassionate standpoint that doesn't ignore the issue, but also doesn't compromise our constitutional freedoms founded on age-old principles? These are questions that require the expertise of not only public health officials, but also philosophers and bioethicists, experts in the fields of wisdom. So I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Julie Ponesse, professor of philosophy with a specialization in ethics at Huron College at Western University, to discuss some of the ethical issues. She also has a background in bioethics, which I think will particularly come in handy for this conversation. Dr. Ponesse, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks very much for having me.
Nice to see you. I'm glad we finally get to have this chat. So, I mean, I spoke about many different things in the opener. There's so many ways we can start with this conversation. But I think kind of the overarching thing that I see in society that many of us sense is there's a sense of fear and to some degree a moral panic. How do you see fear and moral panic playing into COVID policies?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think we are seeing a pervasive kind of panic, a pervasive kind of fear, and that people's decision-making is being motivated more by fear than anything else. And one thing we know from looking at ethical data, psychological data, is that fear does not help us to make sound, rational decisions. And I should qualify that a little bit and say that a certain amount of fear for a certain amount of time can help a little bit. So if you think, you've probably heard of the fight or flight response, right? If you perceive a danger in your immediate vicinity, you sort of, adrenaline kicks in, other stress hormones kick in, and part of their job is to come to your rescue, to harness all of your intellectual and physical abilities in order to manage that stress. Right? Okay. But one thing we also know is that over the long term, you can reach a threshold beyond which those stress hormones are no longer helpful. And I think when you consider the fact that we have been going through this, and I'll just call it, the COVID situation for the last year and a half plus, that is an incredibly long prolongation of a human person being undergoing those kinds of stress hormones. And when we compound that with the fact that we have been isolated, socially isolated, so we don't have our social support systems in order to address and help to mitigate the effect of some of that stress. We're starting to see a number of studies now that are showing the really harmful, deleterious effects of fear on our decision making when it comes to COVID. And one thing we tend to do when we're incredibly afraid is we tend to give greater prominence to the very small chance of something happening if we perceive it to be bad. Right?
Okay, Dr. Ponesse, we got to cut to a commercial break, but this is an interesting point, and I want to give you more time right when we return from these commercials. Please stick around. Welcome back. We're discussing COVID, the ethics of COVID, fear, and how that factors into our decision-making. And joining me is Dr. Julie Ponesse, professor of philosophy with a specialization in ethics and a background in bioethics from the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Ponesse, again, thank you so much for having this discussion. Before we broke for commercial, you were about to launch into an explanation as to how fear can inhibit or impact our decision-making. Please go ahead.
I think one thing we're seeing is parents want to do the right thing, people want to do the right thing, and the increased pressure to vaccinate children seems to, the more I speak to people, come from the fact that they're really worried about their children's health and safety.
Of course.
You mentioned at the very beginning at your intro that children are at a statistically very insignificant chance of suffering severe illness or death from COVID, and they actually have a 99.997% chance of surviving this illness, right? So when you hear a statistic like that, you think that doesn't translate into the extensive vaccination mandates that we're seeing across universities and probably also elementary and high schools as well. So you wonder, well, why is that, right? And I think one thing we can learn from these studies of the effects of fear on decision-making is that when we're really afraid, we tend to overinflate the harm that can come from a possible event, even if the chances of that happening are very, very small. So when I say that statistic, 99.997% survival rate.
And that's for children or for adults?
That's for children. So interestingly, children have a much better chance of managing COVID as a virus. Right?
Okay, but the flip side of that, some would say, well, we know children can be asymptomatic carriers. So if we have children who may have this virus, they are going to be then putting other persons, maybe their teacher or, grandparents or other vulnerable populations perhaps at risk. So people say, well, but then we need to do something about these children. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I agree with you that that's a part of the public narrative. But I think the evidence in the peer-reviewed evidence actually doesn't support the view that children are effective asymptomatic carriers. And if that's true, if we pay closer attention to that evidence, it undermines that argument that we need to vaccinate children for the sake of others. And one thing we need to be really careful about when it comes to public health is being on the lookout for disproportionate harms. So a disproportionate harm, right, is when we propose a treatment for some problem that ends up producing more harm than the initial problem. Right. And because of all of those vaccine side effects that you mentioned earlier on, and we're seeing, more adverse events, including deaths from all of the COVID shots on the market than we have seen for every other vaccine over the last 30 years. Right, that is a serious disproportionate harm that we need to pay attention to. And when it comes to children who have an evolving sense of personhood, an evolving sense of who they are and how to make decisions, and specifically, we're seeing that the vaccines can have really harmful effects on infertility. And when you're asking a 12-year-old or even a 17-year-old to make decisions now that might have an effect on their capacity to bear children 10, 20 years down the road, we need to be very careful about the kind of familial and societal pressure we're putting on them.
It's a very interesting point you bring up. And I have seen this mentioned, and it could have been on something so simple as on social media, but someone brought up an interesting phrase and it caught my eye. They said, never in history have we asked, usually it's the older generation who's sacrificing for the children. I have never seen us asking children to sacrifice for the elderly. And I thought, that made me think for a moment. And it caught me off guard. And I really it caused me to pause.
There are two, I think, really important aspects of that question or that comment. One is that I don't think the science, I don't think the immunological evidence supports the claim that children being vaccinated will help others. And secondly, even if it was true that it does, we're seeing an incredible amount of coercive language and behavior towards children. We're seeing family members tell children that, don't you want to protect your grandmother? Don't you want to be able to see her? Don't you want to be able to see your friends, play with your friends? We're seeing Kieran Moore use that kind of language. He just did a press conference last week where he was talking about the stratified sorts of freedoms that will be allowed for children when they return to the classroom,
right,
and how much more burdensome and how much more of a limitation on the freedoms we will see for children. One thing we know about children is they are incredibly sensitive to guilt. And especially coming from someone who they perceive to have power.
Right.
I think we need to be really aware of the kind of power imbalance that's at work here.
Dr. Ponesse, we've got to cut for break, but I want to dive into this a little bit more after we return. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the ethics and the ethical issues surrounding COVID, how we address COVID, how we're treating COVID, how we approach the issue in general, whether we're parents, children, or government officials. Joining me is Dr. Julie Ponesse. Dr. Ponesse, thanks again. Before the commercial break, I was just engrossed with this conversation that we were having about, what are we asking of children in COVID? Is it fair to put that on them? And I think that's a very good point. You said who should make the decision? Should children be making, or should children really make the decision, or their parents or their teachers that, if they don't get the vaccine, they're going to put someone in harm's way? But it boils down to actually even a more serious question, which is, can a child actually make that? Are they competent enough? Do they have the capacity to even make a decision to direct their healthcare, which in my opinion means then, will the parents really ultimately make those choices?
Yeah. We, in Canada, competency for children is usually assessed on a case-by-case basis. And we don't have a sort of a strict age limit beyond which you're able to make decisions and below which we aren't. And I think that's quite true, because children are very different and they have different levels of maturity and a different sense of who they are. The one thing that is very clear across the board when it comes to making medical decisions is that all Canadians, whether we're talking about children or adults, have the right to accept or refuse medical treatment. And they have the right to make that decision in a fully informed, consensual way, in the absence of coercion and pressure. Right?
Okay. So you mentioned fully and informed, and I think maybe this is where you were headed in a moment. So are Canadians giving informed consent to the vaccine?
To be quite honest with you, I don't think that any Canadian who has received one of the COVID shots so far has been able to give fully informed consent.
Okay, I suspect, and tell me if I'm wrong, it's because these are these mass clinics. You're not, and I do find it a little strange that I guess it was for efficacy, and you had to, there was a big push to vaccinate as many people as possible as soon as possible. But I know I have seen general practitioners say, well, why weren't we allowed to give that vaccine? We consult, we advise, we have that relationship with our patient. We know their healthcare situation. We want to put their mind at ease. And if we got to do that, then we'd have more, say, vaccine compliance, or we'd be able to answer those questions. You simply don't have that opportunity at a mass vaccine clinic.
Yeah, let me qualify what I said there initially, and then I'll try to explain it a little bit more. So I think in some sense we have the facade or the appearance of informed consent. And I think most people that I have spoken to who have gotten one of the vaccines say, well, I went to the pharmacy, I was given a form, it said something about consent on it, I signed it, therefore I gave informed consent. Right? But consent in Canada is a very complex notion. It requires being fully informed. And one of the things that's important for us to be informed about, perhaps the most important thing, is all of the risks. The risks and benefits that come from vaccination, the risks and benefits that come from the illness that vaccination is supposed to address, right? One thing that's important to keep in mind is that all of the COVID shots that are on the market in Canada currently are still in their trial phase. They're to be completed in 2023. That means they have not been fully approved. They have been brought to market under, and they're authorized under an interim order.
Right.
And yeah, and there's a very good reason for that. And that's because the trials have only been going for a year or less now.
Right.
Most vaccines, when they're brought to, by the time they reach the market, have been through a trial process of about 5 to 10 years.
Right. And I think the thinking was that, well, we just don't have enough time. We need to rush this through as much as quickly as possible, you know, for obviously, and to bring back your original word, because of fear that this virus is going to spread rampantly and kill many, many.
Yeah. And I think what I would say to that is that that's a reasonable concern. Fair enough. If people are really terrified that they're going to be vulnerable to COVID, but it should be up to the individual to make that choice. Right.
Correct.
And in order for them to be able to consent fully, they need to have all the information. They need to know what the adverse event data is. Right. And the other component to consent is that it has to be voluntary and free. And that means it has to be in the absence of coercion or duress or pressure of any kind. And there can't be deception involved in that in any way. And one of the problems we're seeing is that there is, in my view, a misrepresentation by our public health officials, by Dr. Kieran Moore, by Dr. Theresa Tam, by our government officials, and I think filtering all the way down through the medical system. There's a misrepresentation of the true risk of COVID versus the true benefits of the vaccines. You know, what we're seeing now is that, the vaccines that are currently available are not having great success at preventing infection with COVID.
Right. I saw some recent numbers out of the United States where they were saying, I think it was about equal, those with or without vaccine who are getting this new Delta variant. We're going to pick up this conversation in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on the ethics surrounding COVID and many of those sub-issues. Dr. Ponesse, before the break, you were suggesting that, Canadians ought to be making informed or giving informed consent when they consent to a vaccine or other medical treatments. You feel that there's been an absence of information, if you will. They're not fully informed. But isn't that up to the individual? I mean, I do my research prior to getting any medical treatment. Is the onus not on me, like buyer beware? I appreciate that there has been allegations of coercion. We saw some vaccine clinics in Toronto offering free ice cream to minors who were to get the jab. That is abhorrent to me. And of course, in America, we heard many news stories coming out of incentives for free lunches and things like this, or free coffees and a free donut. But isn't it up to the individual? Like, if I'm saying that my healthcare decisions, I'm going to be in charge of them, then isn't it up to me then to gather that information and make that decision?
I think you're right. I think, what you're touching on here, I would say, Tanya, is part of a much broader systemic problem that we're seeing in Canada, a much bigger political problem. And I think we have an incredibly heavy reliance on the information that we receive from the media. I was reading an article about the nudge unit that's part of the Privy Council and to address vaccine hesitancy. And we know that the federal government is tracking our behavior and our responses to government protocol and government mandates, and responding accordingly and designing, ads accordingly in order to.
Sorry, how are they tracking our behavior?
Yeah, so we know that they have a behavioral insights team and that they are sort of collecting our data in terms of our response to government initiatives. One thing we also know, interestingly, is that vaccine, cooperativeness versus hesitancy, you might call it, tends to track the kind of information sources that people follow. I think, and just coming back to, the point you made about it being up to the individual, it certainly is. But with that right comes a kind of responsibility. And it's the responsibility to do our due diligence, to make sure that the information that we're gathering that weighs into our decision, that we're gathering from sources that we trust. And I think one problem with this vaccine rollout is that it's happening in the context of your pharmacy to which you've never been before, right? Or a pharmacist assistant that you've never met, and it's taking this very important healthcare decision out of the context of the fiduciary relationship or the relationship of trust between the physician and the patient. And I think if we could put it back in your physician's office and you had that relationship of trust on which to build these questions, we would have a very different sort of dynamic right now.
It's very interesting. And again, I love this discussion. We only have a minute and a half left, and I have two very important questions to get through. But why, like many people watching this program might say, you know what, I haven't heard someone speak like this about COVID. I've heard medical officers of health, we've heard the scientists, and we've seen, our politicians. Why haven't I heard this perspective? Where are the philosophers and ethicists? Have they been relegated to the sidelines?
Most of the philosophers I know are incredibly compliant and think the government is doing a very good job, right? This is a very big topic. I think this would be the subject for a different show. But I think one thing we're seeing that there's an incredible amount of systemic censorship and bullying within science and outside of sort of academic science and other academic disciplines as well. And freedom of inquiry, freedom of learning, the freedom to pursue the truth is not something we're seeing in our institutions of higher learning right now. And I don't think it's something we're seeing in journalism right now.
Okay, well, I look forward, hopefully President Company excluded. Well, I look forward to having you back on, because I think you're right. We do have to have a larger show on this. It's an evolving issue. Let me, with the last 20 seconds we have left, how would you answer Governor Cuomo's line, what is worse than death?
What is worse than death? It's up to the individual to decide. My view is that there are far worse things than death. If you lose your character, if you lose who you are, if you give up your principles out of fear of perishing, then you've lost the point of living in the first place.
Okay, Dr. Ponesse, these are some fine words. Thank you so much for joining me today, and we have to have you back on.
Thank you. It was lovely talking with you.
Thank you. That was a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot, especially about this behavioral insights team that allegedly the government has. We'll have to get into that a little bit later. But I think there are many ethical issues surrounding COVID, and perhaps we haven't taken pause to really examine and think about them fully. I hope we will continue to do that, especially here on this show, because these are important decisions that we're making. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.